Hey man,
Hi, John.
how you doing?
I'm doing quite well. So glad to get a chance to speak with you today. Thanks
Oh
for,
yeah, this is great. Well, thanks for doing this with me. I appreciate it.
yeah, appreciate it. Appreciate your time. I think you said that you were going to be in the operating room until just before our meeting. So
Yes, it's perfect.
nice.
This is
Well,
perfect.
um, John, is it John Pohl? Am I pronouncing that right?
Yes, that's right.
So you're a physician and specifically a pediatric gastroenterologist, as well as a professor of pediatrics at the University of Utah.
Mhm.
And I'm really excited to talk to you about your medical practice and your current research.
Absolutely.
But before asking you to share a bit about that, I wanted to set the broader context for me. Um, to try to say a bit about why I find it so helpful to interview and dialogue with physicists and biologists and physicians, other philosophers as well. And it's because I think our civilization at this time is not doing a very good job integrating science and scientific findings into everyday life. And that's everything from how we respond in light of medical knowledge to a pandemic, how we respond politically, but also how we understand the deeper meaning of human life and the place of human beings in the universe. And so as a philosopher, I kind of see my role as helping to mediate between um, the scientific process of inquiry and discovery, to mediate between that and the general public, to try to communicate about what's the meaning of these scientific findings, because oftentimes scientists themselves will carry an unacknowledged metaphysics that's operating in the background of their thought when they communicate to the public, and we all do that. It's not a problem, but I think what philosophy can help us do is surface those metaphysical assumptions, so that we're not sort of confusing science with, say, a particular religious worldview or a particular metaphysical orientation. And so, what I'm so excited to talk to you about today is, the role that uh, both medicine and faith play in the civilizational project that we human beings are engaged in. And so, as a way into that, John, could you share a bit about how it is you ended up becoming a physician? Is this something you always saw yourself wanting to do, or was there some important event in
Yeah.
your childhood that led you in this direction?
Yeah, I mean, Matt, I think that's the thing that we all have a metaphysics we all come behind,
Mhm.
and we all have a psychological background in terms of um, how we came to be what we are. And I think the frustration sometimes that I feel is that when we have science and we have theology, and I actually would put philosophy in there to some degree, we say it has to be a certain way in terms of specifically, can you understand science, but you have to be a certain way in terms of, are you being a mechanist or a naturalist or something like that, that it has to be that way. And likewise, a lot of times we see the alternative where people of various religious strains, it's assumed that people are fundamentalists in their beliefs, and don't take nuance into place. And we can talk about this later, but I ran into a lot of frustration in my own life in that regard,
Mhm.
because I saw this as two different worlds and didn't realize that there are areas where there are touch points. And there's actually a fair number of us out there, not just you and me talking. But I think that we are a silent group a lot of times in terms of people hearing how these things can be placed together. And you're exactly right. I mean, I think climate change is a great example. Um, you know, I come from the Christian religion, but I think you can look at other religious traditions as well. I mean, we're supposed to love God and love others. We're instructed to take care of the earth, the way I read Genesis. And you think that we would come together to want to make the world better for each other and for other species, and how we want to protect the planet. And so sometimes I get frustrated when I hear people who are from Christian traditions who think that we are not supposed to be that way. That's a problem for me. And then likewise, as you point out, the pandemic, you talk about a place where religious people can come together to try to support one another with vaccinations. And my own personal belief system, a little mantra that I kind of use is God gave us brains, brains gave us science, science gave us vaccines. So vaccines are a gift from God. So these are things that I think about. So I appreciate you bringing that out. So in terms of, I think you asked why I became a physician. I've had 2 heart surgeries in my life. Once as an infant, at 6 weeks of age, I had congenital heart disease, and then another time 9 years ago. So early on in my life with my heart surgery, I was kind of one of the newer generation children who was having surgery done. So there was a lot of clinic visits involved, hospital visits involved. So I was around healthcare. I grew up having parents that were academic. My dad was a history professor, and my mom was an English professor. So education was a big deal in our house. And I tend to I kind of went into or had big interest, I should say, into the biological sciences. As I was in high school, I thought that was really interesting. And then once I got to college, it became clear to me that medicine worked for me. I did like interacting with people. And so that's where it seemed like it worked. The one issue that I always, I think it's kind of affected my life. The one issue that I think was a little bit different for me was that I had a pull toward non-medical, non-technical writing. My mom used to teach Lauren Isley, and so I started reading Lauren Isley very early in life, and still is a very influential writer to me. So it's influenced my career later on in that while in medicine, I've done other things in terms of written some poetry, written some articles that have gotten published in Theology and things like that. But that's how I went into medicine.
Mm. And in terms of your religious faith, were you raised Christian, or did you come to that later in life?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I was raised Christian. My parents were definitely not fundamentalists in their belief system. My dad came from Lutheran background. My mom came from Southern Baptist background. So I had relatives in both of those streams, which was interesting sometimes. Mm-hmm. Many good things about that. Sometimes some things that I wish were a little bit different, but overall, generally a very positive experience. Mm-hmm. I went through the typical period of doubt that many people go through. And I think it's very healthy to go through that period of doubt as you get older. I have no issues with that whatsoever. And so I pretty much strayed away from that belief system for about 12 years. I don't think I was ever an atheist, but I definitely for sure was agnostic. There was a lot of not really knowing. And no one can ever know, actually, right, if you think about it. But in my very, very late 20s, I came back to faith again. Interestingly, at that time, it's the interesting things that can kind of lure you. I had a pastor at that time who'd been an astronomer in a prior career. And so he really had been in both camps in terms of being in hard science and being in theology. And that was very influential for me. My wife and I were going to that church. And so I ended up heading back into church on a regular basis. Served as an elder in a couple churches, taught Sunday school. To be honest with you, I kind of went through a reconstruction period or deconstruction period, I should say, probably in my late 30s. I was attending church on a regular basis, but the church I was mainly in was often separating science and faith, especially in the world of evolution.
Hmm.
And I had done some work in college with evolutionary biology. And I think, you can be a physician and not accept evolutionary theory, but I think it'd be awfully hard when you take all the basic science classes that you do. And I grew up in a home where evolution was accepted. So I went through some profound deconstruction in terms of what does it mean to be a Christian? What does it mean to be a person of faith, to be quite honest with you, and reconstructed right now where I'm at now, where I have a belief in God and I consider myself a Christian, but there's a lot of things that I get really laid back about in terms of when people make specific doctrinal statements that absolutely don't mean much to me at times.
Mm-hmm. Great. Thank you for that background.
Yeah.
We'll circle back
Sure.
to the relationship between, your medical practice and religion, but I'm curious to hear a bit about your current research. I've enjoyed reading a blog post of yours from a few years ago about the microbiome and the role that these really trillions of other cells, bacterial cells that help sustain everything from our immune system to our mental health to the proper digestive processes of our bowels, as many people already know about. So what drew you into this particular area of research, and what are you finding?
Absolutely. So roundabout after medical school, I did a residency in pediatrics, but I enjoyed gastroenterology. And so I went and did a fellowship at the University of Cincinnati after doing my residency, which was a nice program. Very research-based, and so taught me some good fundamentals in research. Then I practiced at Texas A&M for 9 years, and then I moved out to University of Utah 13 years ago. I'm very much driven out I love the Intermountain West. I've been out here for many years visiting, and so I moved out here 13 years ago. So as a pediatric gastroenterologist, you see a lot of things about the microbiome. I mean, the microbiome of an infant is important almost immediately as soon as you are born. Your microbiome, in other words, the intestinal lining with the bacteria in it, is almost sterile at birth. It quickly becomes colonized, and it makes a big difference in terms of health, prevention of allergic properties, immune protection, things like that. So my daily work life, I do see this. Let's talk about some specific things. Premature infants get a disease called necrotizing enterocolitis. It's a long word, but it's abbreviated as NEC or NEC, where the intestine of premature infants, and typically the very premature, is very thin. It's easier for bacteria to go across the intestinal wall and then cause bloodstream infections, death of the baby. It's actually a big cause of both injury and death in a newborn ICU. And so there have been experiments with, this bacteria is getting through. A lot of these bacteria appear to be of pathogenic or dangerous strains. What if we gave probiotics that are potentially helpful, such as probiotics, such as lactobacillus? And there's a lot of research and clinical trials that giving these good bacteria actually can colonize the intestine, make the healthy intestinal cells come together, so it's harder for bacteria to come through, to basically compete for niche space. And there are many countries, such as in Taiwan, where this is done on a regular basis. The United States is starting to catch on as well. The problem with probiotic research is it's so dependent on the type of bacteria you use and with the strain, and then how much you're giving. And sometimes it's hard to get those exact amounts, which can cause some inconsistency in studies, but I think that's very interesting. The other thing that I find really interesting is in the world of cystic fibrosis. And in the world of cystic fibrosis, It's a problem with your chloride channel on all of your cells. And so you get thickened secretions. To be quite honest, it's hard for water to get expressed through. So that's why if you think about the typical cystic fibrosis patient that you might see in a fundraiser, they're having problems coughing, they have oxygen. Honestly, with a lot of the new medications that we have right now, we're kind of in a golden age for cystic fibrosis right now. But other organs are affected as well. So these kiddos can become extremely constipated. They can have then subsequent inflammation of the bowel because they have a buildup of bad bacteria. They can have buildup bile, gets to their liver, starts having problems, things like that. Well, the fascinating thing is this crosstalk, this unusual relationship between the bacteria, specifically in the intestine and the lungs. And there appears to be some type of signaling between the bacteria in the intestine, the bacteria of lungs, causing progressive lung damage, changing the lung bacteria to more dangerous types. We're not really sure why, but it does happen. Now, how fascinating is that? You have two separate organs and the bacteria appear to be communicating. Perhaps there's some passage through the bloodstream. Perhaps there's some passage of proteins that are signaling. We don't know. But then that comes the next thing. What if you take the gut bacteria and you make it healthy? For example, if you gave more probiotics, can that potentially preserve lung function? And indeed, there appears to be some effect there of which we're not entirely clear. And I think that to me is very fascinating. And then the last thing I'll talk to you about is, it's a little gross, but it's interesting, is fecal transplantation, which you may have heard about. So basically, we can have patients who can have pretty severe types of infections. There's one in particular called C. diff that can be deadly. And you can take the fecal material of a healthy person. You can take the sick patient, clean out their bowel, and then do a transplant, fecal transplant up and through the colon. Sometimes you go through the tube down the nose into the stomach, into the intestine, and you can cure the infection. And that is absolutely amazing. And it's a removal of the bad bacteria to the good bacteria. So what's more then, could you do that for other things? So two caveats to that: never ever do this at home. There are some crazy websites where people recommend doing this at home. I would never do this at home. And indeed, there are situations where people have gotten infected with worse infections when they try these things at home. You'd want to do it in a controlled situation. But there are other diseases. So for example, what we call inflammatory bowel disease, which is an autoimmune disease where the white blood cells start attacking the intestine, like Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis. There's research going into that right now. What's really unusual is in mouse models, you can take mice that are obese and mice that are prone to be lean, and the mice with a diet that makes them fat. If you do a fecal transplant to those mice, the mice that are prone to be lean can gain weight. So there are interesting things. So the question is, are there other aspects? I don't think it's a panacea just yet. But the point being is that the microbiome is extensive. I look at it as we're the organism all being part of one. The bacteria is part of the environment. The bacteria is in us. We exist. There's some communication going on there. And I think what we'll talk about later on is are there other aspects, and these are not things that I do research on or do in clinical practice, but there is very interesting research out there in terms of the microbiome, the intestinal microbiome, and how it relates to certain neurologic issues such as depression, anxiety, issues like dementia and things like that. And that's very fascinating.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, wow, thank you for sharing a bit about these exciting frontiers in medicine. What you're sharing makes me think of there's a certain view of evolution. And, you mentioned that going through your medical training, you would have found it pretty hard to deny evolutionary theory. But there's a popular construal of this theory that it's about that the history of life and its evolution is all about the competition among individuals. And I think when you look more deeply at the life process itself, say, the way you're describing an infant being born with a sterile intestinal tract, but then immediately being sort of colonized by bacteria that allow us to digest food. And clearly there's all sorts of other regulatory processes between organs going on that's facilitated by bacterial signaling. And so it's as if the human being at birth is not a complete organism until this whole ecosystem of other organisms enters into this symbiotic relationship with us. And so to me, this is just one example of the many ways in which the process of evolution is more about cooperating symbionts, right, than it is about competing individuals. Now, obviously, cooperation, competition, these are terms derived from our human behavior and interaction, and we don't want to easily just project and anthropomorphize the non-human world. And yet, I think symbiosis, if we leave out competition, cooperations, what symbiosis shows us is that throughout the evolutionary process, evolutionary advances occur, new species emerge as a result of relationships, profound relationships between organisms. And so when you get to something as complex as a human being, we're more like walking ecosystems than we are sort of isolated individuals. And so I think the type of research that you're doing helps us tell a different story about life that's not a story of separate individuals competing with one another, but rather a story that's really driven by relationship, right? And the sense in which what we are as an individual is always, in a sense, always also a community, and that we can't sort of abstractly separate these two concepts. Does that make sense to you, or how do you feel about that? Yeah,
absolutely. Well, if we consider medicine a science, and I don't know if it's a science or it's a weird hybrid, but we do research at times. But I think it is, first of all, a relationship. So medicine, first of all, most importantly, is a relationship. The relationship you have with patients. As someone who works in a subfield of pediatrics, it's a relationship it's your relationship with the patient and their families. And I think that's very true. I mean, there's the statement of red in tooth and claw as a definition for evolution in terms of competition at all times. But I think that is one side of the coin. And I know you do quite a bit of work with process philosophy and process theology, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, because I may be wrong here, but if I look at the organism moving through time, there's going to be, the way I look at it as a religious person, is that there's going to be a lore at all levels. And sure, the level may be, or the lore may be to be cooperative, but sometimes we may be too competitive. And I think we forget about the cooperative part of evolution. Honestly, you can make that a metaphor. We forget about the cooperative part of life in our world. You look at politics in the United States these days, where it just seems like cooperation is not even something that people want to think about, which I think is very interesting. But no, I completely agree. I think looking at how the microbiome can promote health, as far as we understand it so far, I mean, I think it's a good way to look at altruism in general, altruism among people. If we know that these little creatures, for which we are nothing more than a coral reef sometimes, are being helpful to us. And I think it really kind of goes against some of the ideas that people have sometimes about social Darwinism, because we're saying that no, actually cooperation is key. Sure, there's competition, but cooperation is key. And maybe they're both there at the same time, but it sure seems that we often forget about cooperation.
Yeah, yeah. So I think you're right that to say it's all competition is one-sided. I didn't mean to imply that there's no competitive element in the evolutionary process. Clearly there is, particularly among animal species. I think when you're
Mate
talking about
selection. Yeah. Mhm.
when you're talking about microorganisms, it's not even clear, like with bacteria. I know some biologists, microbiologists would argue it's not even clear where one species line ends and another begins, because they're constantly sharing genes across their membrane, like lateral gene transfer. And so
Absolutely. Yeah.
the whole idea of a species boundary. So what's the individual, right? And so it's like, depending on the scale you're looking at, what looks like an individual at this scale, when you zoom in, you realize, oh, that's a community. So like the human being looks like an individual, and to some extent we are individuated and we have agency and consciousness at an individualized level. But when you zoom in, oh, we're a community of cells. And then when you zoom in on a cell, it's like, it looks like a unit. It has a life cycle and a function and its own genome. But you zoom
Right.
in a little bit further and you see, oh, this is a community of organelles that themselves used to be, in many cases, free living cells themselves, the mitochondria and so on, chloroplasts in plant cells. And so there's this nesting effect, right, in reality. And evolution seems to be the process of elaborating ever more complexly nested arrangements or organizations. And so when we think about this in a process philosophical way, as you said, it's a profoundly relational situation that we find ourselves in. And in this type of a context where relationality is a sort of metaphysical first principle, I think it raises certain theological questions. I think for some Christians and Jews and Muslims, or anyone who believes in some sense of an individual soul, the question becomes, well, what's the destiny of that soul in the context of a profoundly relational, physical and biological world? And also, what's the nature of the divine? What type of God would it have been that would create or lure a world like ours into existence? So when you think about the process theological proposal here, that the divine is not sort of unmoved, the creator is not unaffected by the creation, but in some way responsive to it, to us, that has profound theological implications that are in some cases pretty unorthodox, let's say, when it comes to the problem of evil or divine omnipotence or other questions like that. And so how do you situate yourself in the theological landscape here, thinking about process theology, but also, an evolutionary cosmology and evolutionary biology? What type of God would create in this way, right?
Right. So this is what I think about it. So as background, you and I have know a similar person, Tom Ward, and I'm actually doing his doctorate program in open relational theology at Northwind right now. My kids are now out of the house and they're in college. And so my wife and I are doing some different things now that we're not dealing with that aspect of our life. And I've had a big interest in this for a while, in process and open relational theology. But now that I have more time to do reading and get deeper into my thought, this has been very helpful for me. And let me give you some background why. I think the hardest thing, there's a lot of things that are difficult to deal with in medicine. There's a lot of wonderful things, but the hardest thing to deal with is the human condition. When you see children that can have different outcomes strictly due to social determinants of health. In the United States, that would include access to healthcare, as an example. Or access to food would be another example. And you can take that to the extreme when you deal with a dying child, as an example, in pediatrics. And so when you're dealing with the theodicy and the problem of evil, that for me has always been a big stopping point for me. And when I said I went through some deconstruction, quite honestly, that was a lot of my deconstruction. There were some other things as well. And so I was doing some searching to figure out how to deal with this, because I just could not reconcile loving God with that. And just the way I am made, atheism wasn't going to be an answer for me. And I appreciate people who think that is, but just it wasn't for me. And so once I was introduced to the strands of process thought, it made quite a bit of a difference. And so the point I'm trying to make is that having a God who lures us for the good, but allows us to have free will. And if we say that a God loves us so much to allow us to have free will, then I think that such a God would allow free will in nature. And so, unfortunately, things are going to happen. There is the second law of thermodynamics. Things will break. People will die. But understanding that, one, in this belief system, God is working with us and frankly, all of nature to try to make things for the good, which I identify as increasing creation, increasing creativity over time. That to me, I find very comforting. I find it comforting that I have a God that either voluntarily or involuntarily is not omnipotent. I find that helpful as well, because when I have seen patients die, I think I would have a hard time understanding why a God would choose to know ahead of time. But of course, you know better than I that omnipotence may not even be the earliest interpretation of Christianity. That may have been come on later on in with Roman and specifically Greek influence. But the other thing that I look at, Matt, when I think about this, is the whole idea of free will. I just have such a hard time, obviously from a religious perspective, from people who are completely deterministic. But when I think about people who talk about, and of which I'm no mathematician, but talk about particle physics, who think that this is all completely deterministic, there becomes a point as a physician when you're seeing someone suffer. Why are particles doing this? I mean, it's just going to end up being this way no matter what. I mean, that to me makes no sense for me, for my metaphysics. And we all have our own metaphysics. We all have our own psychology that influences us. But for my metaphysics, that makes absolutely no sense. And so that's where I find the God of process, the God of open relational theology. I do like the idea of open relational theology through Dr. Ord because of the idea of love as a background. But that is how it has helped me in life. Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally. I can really understand how, as a physician, you would need an answer to this question. And if atheism wasn't going to do it for you, then your theology was going to need to provide you with some justification for the suffering that you have encountered as a physician. And so it's
right.
I think a really concrete example of why these ideas matter in people's lives.
Right.
And so, you mentioned a particle physicist, and I was just sort of engaging in a exchange with some philosophers and physicists who were in dialogue with each other. Maybe Sean Carroll, popular.
Well, yeah, I've read his books. Yeah,
read his books.
I've heard his podcast. Yeah,
But I think, he has a view of the universe as kind of deterministic based on this core theory of particle physics and whatever human consciousness is. He says, he agrees there's something like consciousness, it exists, it's real, but he thinks it's derived from and ultimately reducible to the mechanistic playing out of these particles in quantum fields. And putting aside the issue of what a particle is in the context of quantum theory, because it's pretty bizarre situation that 20th century physics finds itself in, when the so-called particles actually they're not simply located and are entangled and sort of
quantum wave duality and
clouds of probability than they are
Yeah.
like discrete bits of material substance. And so I'm not sure what they mean when they refer to particles, what a materialist might mean when they refer to matter. But putting that aside, I think why, when I ask the question or try to defend even the legitimacy of doing something like theology, I think the key for me is that we're taking the human being in all of our complex psychology and the moral dilemmas that we find ourselves faced with. We're taking that human being seriously enough as an expression of this universe. And that, I think the reason I would take theology seriously is that we as human beings, as products of this evolutionary process that's billions of years old, the concerns that we find ourselves facing and holding, and the moral dilemmas that we find ourselves challenged by are in some way an expression of this universe. And theology is our attempt, again, as expressions of the universe, to understand what is ultimately going on here. And I think a materialistic reduction to particles and an attempt to explain everything in those terms is, in a way, it's as though there's this need for a simple explanation that allows us to not have to pursue answers to these big questions, as if, well, whatever human beings are struggling with, I mean, I'm sure like these physicists as human beings, struggle with these problems just as much as anyone else. But rather than seeing that as somehow significant for the nature of reality as such, they sort of compartmentalize it and say, well, this is just something that happened, that human beings exist, pure accident, random chance. And so ultimately it doesn't matter, whether I do good or evil or what happens to human civilization. The universe is just a bunch of particles. And so it just feels to me that it's like a foundational existential question that you have to ask, like, are the moral dilemmas that we face as human beings significant for the whole of reality, or are we just deluded by a sense of self-importance that is ultimately meaningless?
Yeah, no, I think that's excellent. And I have learned so much from people with various belief systems. And I'm not just talking about the whole spectrum, from being a believer in God to being an atheist, but just various, my friends who've been Hindu, my friends who are Muslim, my friends who are Jewish. I mean, you can learn so many. I mean, I've learned quite a bit just talking to my Jewish friends, in terms of there's a lot of process in their belief system, in my opinion. It's really been helpful. And I have friends and family who are atheists, and I learned quite a bit from them. And I think they actually help me work through. I like to be challenged when these questions come up. I don't think we should ever challenge somebody angrily. I don't think that ever helps at all. And I think a lot of times when we see some of these more public debates or so much anger, I just sometimes wonder if we just all work together at some of these contact points, how much progress we could make in terms of, what we can do to fellow fellow humans in terms of what we could do in terms of making the planet better. So that's always a point of frustration. But to your point, a few things. I don't know. I looked one time, and you know this better than me, but I was curious about what percentage of the world considers itself just religious. And I found this, some people saying they think it's probably about 80% of the world. So there's been 100 billion humans, I guess, so far on Earth, 100 billion Homo sapiens, and 80%, perhaps more further back, that are religious. Then I would argue that theology is extremely important, because this is a process that a lot of people follow. This is a center point of many people's lives. And so when you're dealing with what is the basis of reality, what is the basis of suffering, looking at it from a theological perspective is important. And I think theologians and philosophers to a degree should push around the edges to see what we can learn. And I, in the Psalms, when King David reportedly talks about, when I look at the stars in the sky and I wonder how you made me. I mean, he was observing. He was trying to say, I don't understand this. I'm seeing these things, these bright lights out there. I want to understand my relationship with God. And I think in many ways, when we see advances in science, for example, I think it's very helpful from a religious perspective. So what does this tell us? What does this tell us about God? If we believe in God, what does this tell us? I think it's actually very helpful, as opposed to putting God in a box and saying it's just a certain way, because we've learned so much about the natural world. And again, I don't know Sean Carroll. I think he's really brilliant. I would hate to debate him. He'd probably just destroy me. But my understanding, he's kind of more of a compatibilist when it comes to determinism, I think, right? I mean, I think he yeah.
Sure. Yeah. We'd have to get into the details of that position. And,
the point I'm trying to make, though, is that, and I'm sure that he would be able to explain this to me and I would understand it better. But I think that a lot of times we act as if the world is completely objective. And I think that we forget that there's a whole subjective part of reality. And there are many people who feel that that's people who are philosophers and theologians. I think John Howard, I think, is that the theologian, I think, who has talked about that the whole aspect of missing subjectivity. We're missing a whole part of the study of reality. Now, let's be clear. Vaccines prevent COVID-19. That's an objective reality. But there are subjective aspects of life as well. And I have always wondered, and we always have to follow our rabbit trails down, what a pure reductionist, pure materialist, how would they handle the tragedies in life? And I just don't know. And it's not my way to judge. I have a hard time with that. My father died from a car wreck like 6 years ago. If I truly said I was a materialist, I was like, well, the particles, it was going to eventually happen no matter what, from the Big Bang onward. I think that I understand Dr. Carroll in terms of Everettianism. I think that's actually really very interesting. My understanding is that the universe is just one big wave function. So there might be some reality where my dad's alive, but then he dies in some other reality. I just don't understand how that would work in my subjective sense of the world in terms of my emotional state. Now, I would argue that he and I probably look at that differently in some ways the same, but that's one thing, again, as a physician dealing with human suffering, that I have a hard time with.
Yeah.
And it would be interesting, I mean, his whole idea of the many worlds interpretation, and then your work that you've done on process. It's great to have these models. I think his model is important, your model is important. And I love this debate, only if we look at debate, not at screaming at each other, which I'm sure never doesn't happen, but just where are the touch points? Where can we learn from each other and potentially advance these ideas. Does that make sense? That's where I think it's most helpful.
Yeah, no, totally. I don't like being in debates. I admit that sometimes they can be entertaining. They can really be frustrating too, but I really prefer dialogue. I want to arrive at some shared understanding. I mean, if after a conversation with someone who I, assume I disagree with on some issues, if we don't arrive at consensus on something that, we can take away from that, then it's a failure. It's not for me ever about winning a debate. I think that's just the wrong approach to take to intellectual adventure. If we're not trying to learn from each other all the time, then we're doing it wrong. But I think,
well, that's the medieval scholastic method in many ways was you'd write a response
right
to your opponent and pointing out ways that could be helpful to improve the argument.
right
And
right.
I wouldn't want to have medieval medicine,
Yeah.
but I wouldn't mind that aspect of dialogue sometimes.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think when we ask in a poll, like people around the planet, are you religious or not? It's really hard to know what people mean by religion. I mean, there could be that 20% that said no, they think of themselves as spiritual, but not religious. There's a growing number of people who identify in that way in Western democracies mostly. But if you define religion maybe more broadly, then I don't think it's unfair to say that a materialist is still expressing a religious view. They're taking a position on the ultimate nature of reality, and in some way finding it satisfying morally. They've accepted it as a human being, and that in some way it is allowing them to, get the job of life done. In the sense of
Absolutely.
basic motivations. Yeah.
Absolutely. All have our metaphysics.
Yeah.
And
right.
I don't think you should insult someone's metaphysics.
Right.
But again, I think dialogue is important, but at least in Western culture, through media and social media streams, it seems like the answer is to just scream at each other. And then the world thinks that there's just these two camps in which there's actually a lot of nuance.
Totally.
In both camps. And, I think the nuns, those who are, who believe in, what the word I'm looking for, they believe there's something, but they can't really define it with any of the religious streams. I think they're actually very important in many ways. That might be the edges of evolution, what's going to happen, social evolution, I guess, maybe of what's going to happen with religion. I mean, I can't guarantee that Christianity is going to be around in thousands of years. But when people say Christianity has always been the same, and I cannot speak for other religious streams, but as a Christian, I mean, you can look through our history. I don't think early church fathers would recognize what we do now.
Right.
So, what is that? Is that a lure? It's definitely process. It's definitely something changing. It's definitely, I would argue, increased creativity over time.
Right. And one of the things that really inspires me about sort of process theological point of view, and also in the background for me, is a sort of depth psychological or archetypal psychological view coming out of the work of Carl Jung. And he wrote this book called Answer to Job. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, but it basically presents the idea that the divine, that the Old Testament and the Bible as a whole is basically describing an evolutionary process of the divine in relationship to the human, and that the divine nature, much like the nature of the universe, is in some sense unfinished and still in the making. And that, as Whitehead would put it, the power of God is the worship that God inspires, right? And so that's how Whitehead puts it in his book, Religion in the Making. The power of God is the worship that God inspires. So in other words, there's the lure, this divine lure, and creatures respond to the lure, and to the extent that they respond positively, God is empowered, right? And that means that the divine is caught up in this coevolution with human beings and with the whole of creation. And what, to me, that, that's a lot of responsibility, but it's also inspiring enough to be the fountain for a renewed civilization, I think, because it gives human beings a sense of purpose that's not inflated and self-important, but nonetheless still grand enough, to keep the adventure of civilization going. And because I think, we're in quite a dilemma right now. I think talking to young people, not being sure what kind of future they're going to have waiting for them, and we are in dire need of sources of meaning to help us through this. It's really a evolutionary bottleneck that we're faced with as a civilization at this point. And there are economic and technological things that are important that need to be developed, but I think there's also a cultural dimension here, and a psychological dimension, and ultimately a religious and spiritual dimension. And that doesn't get talked about much on the nightly news or in any of these popular debates in the culture war. There's more of a sense of individual groups thinking they have the right answer, and not much of a sense of the larger cosmic process that's unfolding. That I like the way you were describing. It was almost like you were saying nature, the evolution of the cosmos, is a kind, and the scientific study of it is a kind of revelation, and that science is engaged in the process.
Yeah, book of nature.
Real nature.
It's book of nature. Yeah, absolutely.
Exactly. And it's publicly available divine scripture, right? But written in the form of the periodic table of elements and the genetic sequence, and all the other ways that science illuminates the world around us. Mm-hmm. We can come together around that as evidence of a creative purpose, right? That we are participating in and with.
Yeah, I was thinking about. I was reading some. For a while now, I've been interested in the philosophy of science, which I think actually has a lot of crossover sometimes. Mm-hmm. And I'll run this by you. I was reading about Lakatos and his belief of the research program and the good versus the bad research program. And let's put this in the concept. Like you, I have a daughter who, I worry about our children. I have a daughter who's 21 and a daughter who's 18. And what we're leaving them with. So a good research program, simply put, there's lots of things to it, but simply put, a good research program will give you more questions over time. A bad research program, that which in the history of science goes away, there's the questions become stale. You're not making progress. So if we worry about what's happening to our planet, and I worry quite a bit, heck, I live in Utah. We had horrible fires this summer. We had some days where we had red air alerts. We were told to not go outside. I was in a hospital setting with a very good air system, and it smelled like fire. It was unbelievable. And now they've pushed off ski season because of our weather. That's a bad research program. We're not inventing new things. We're just running up against the same wall of not listening about what's going on with the environment, not listening to the research. And I think again, I'm a religious person, and my mantra always is God gave us brains, brains gave us science, science gave us. And I look at global warming research as God's giving us a gift about what we should be paying attention to. And I wish that that was picked up, one, by religious people, in terms of, okay, there is science. And then I wish it was also picked up by some, not all at all, but a minority, but by some non-religious people who say, oh, those stupid religious people, they're just so dumb, I'm not even going to interact with them, right? And so in terms of addressing issues like global warming, and I could make the exact same, by the way, argument when it comes to what's going on with our pandemic. I am just shocked at times, and I don't know what the experience is with your friends, but just the degree of not wanting to communicate over this issue. I mean, sorry, vaccines work, but I'm willing to sit and talk with somebody and say, this is why I think vaccines work, to have read the research why vaccines work, as opposed to I'm just going to ignore that whole population. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. And the same thing goes on with what's going on with our planet right now. Is we need to be communicating with each other. And I think especially as religious people, we need to reach out to both of these extremes and try to bring them together. Where are these contact points that we can come together? Because if I believe in the God of process, I actually, as an open relational person, I think God loves us, but God gives us free will. If we destroy everything, I mean, there's going to be creativity somewhere else in this universe. But God gave us the free will, but why don't we do the free will for the good?
And do you think that, I mean,
I don't know if you agree with me, but.
Oh yeah, no, I was nodding along. I think, it's a very pithy way of putting it. God gave us brains, brains gave us science, because the alternative, I think, is very, it requires some special pleading, like the idea that if you do believe in God, particularly an all-powerful God, why would human beings possess intelligence that would, why would God have made us with these intelligent minds and make us capable of doing scientific research if the things that we discovered were somehow evil or contrary to, the divine plan or something? It just doesn't make sense. And I think we need to talk more about science in public, and we need to talk more about these ultimate questions, theological questions in public. We're kind of afraid to talk about religion in polite company, but if we can do so with a kind of diplomatic intent and in a non-judgmental way, I think it's absolutely essential to arriving at some shared conception of the good life. Because if we're going to have a successful civilization, we need to be able to talk about these things together. We can't just privatize all of it.
Yeah, the thing I've been thinking about as I've taken this classes under Dr. Ward is because he's assigned me quite a bit of theology books to read, but also a fair number of philosophy books to read. But, I think it's kind of a three-circle thing where, I just kind of drew a little thing here. I don't know if you can see this, but, science, theology, and philosophy. I mean, it's at these touch points is where we need to have our communication.
Yeah.
To see what we can do to improve things. And that goes for economies, how we can help the poor, global warming, pandemics, prevention of fascism. There's so many aspects of there that I think would be just incredibly important.
Yeah. So we've ranged a bit in this last hour.
We haven't even talked about the microbiome and brain activity. Yeah, I'm sorry. I went off on that.
No, that's fine. This has all been really interesting, and I found it interesting. Hopefully our listeners later will as well. I don't know how much time you have left, but is there direction you'd like to go from here? Something
Well, first of all, I blocked off my afternoon to hang out with you talking.
Oh, cool.
So you just you do what you want to do. Let's just
Great.
keep talking.
Okay, wonderful. So yeah, let's talk more about that relationship between the microbiome and mental health would be the medical phrase for it, or even more broadly and philosophically, the relationship between the mind and the body, or perhaps the soul and the body. I mean, as a physician, you're trying to heal people, heal their bodies, but obviously I assume you see the soul and the body as at least intimately related, if not in some sense fused. And so how do you engage with this perennial problem, the mind body? The problem is that there seems to be some kind of a dualism, and yet there's also plenty of evidence of a intimate relationship between the two. So does the microbiome and its relationship to mental health help us solve this dilemma, or what are the other ways
so that's
you look
interesting.
for it?
So first of all, we got a big cloud cover just now, and I'm in a back bedroom, so I turned the light on. So let me know if it's too much. I apologize about that. So so I mean, once we started thinking about the microbiome and its effects, it really kind of gave us a different idea of what it's like to be human, and what it's like, in my opinion, to be conscious. So microbiome research really kind of picked up in the 1980s. Way back in the early 1800s. And do not do this at home. This is just, pre-modern medicine. But there was a doctor who, I don't know how I got into this idea, but the patient was having like Parkinson's type symptoms, and did a bowel purge, and the symptoms temporarily went away. So even very early on, there was something people were seeing. Before we got on this call together, I looked this up a few years ago, and I was curious again. So probiotics have just exploded on the medical literature. I did some searching. There's almost 35,000 articles now on PubMed, which is a big archive for medical research on probiotics, and 11,000 articles on prebiotics, which are giving some of the substrate for good bacteria to live on. And then something called symbiotics. There's almost 2,000 articles when you combine probiotics and prebiotics together. And on PubMed, you can actually graph out, and the graph of publications for probiotics and the microbiome, it's just like shooting straight up. So the interesting thing in terms of the brain, and then we can take a look at how you and I might interpret that as consciousness, is that there is known to be a brain-gut axis. Kind of poorly defined, but when I say brain-gut axis, they communicate with each other. This is through inflammatory, or I should say immune modulation areas. This is through gut hormones. This is through serotonin. There is some nerve communication there. The big one, interestingly, being the vagus nerve, one of the cranial nerves that kind of goes down and controls heart and lungs and intestines. But the point being is that we can see certain bacteria appearing to have some health responses. So first of all, easy. You get a salmonella infection or E. coli infection, you get bloody diarrhea. So all right off the bat, there is a bacteria body connection. Well, we took that further a while back when we talked about those little babies getting really sick, where there's some communication between the bacteria and the rest of the body to cause a baby to get bacteria in the bloodstream. And then we talked a little bit about how patients with cystic fibrosis, if they have more dangerous type bacteria in their, less healthy type bacteria in their gut, they can have worsening lung disease. So we know there's probably a gut-lung axis, actually. But what about the brain? Well, the first thing to think about is when we talk about something that I see quite a bit, vaguely defined as we call functional abdominal pain, or some people call it irritable bowel syndrome. where often, not always, but often people, when they get anxious, can have abdominal pain and a change in bowel habits. I apologize for talking so much about that, but that's what I do for a living. But isn't it interesting that there are some people who, when they get anxious, they have a change in their bowel habits or their stomach hurts? Well, indeed, in many of these patients, there is differences in their microbiome. So there's been some interesting work, and I am by far not a big research person in this. I deal with the clinical aspects of this. My research has been on pancreatitis, which I've done quite a bit in the past, which there's some microbiome things there. But let's talk about this specific aspect that I see in my clinical practice. So a lot of times you can say, well, all these bacteria, most bacteria are just there hanging out, doing what they do. The next group are there to help you, and there's a very small group that can make you sick in your intestinal tract. But there's two big groups. One group called the firmicutes. You don't need to remember this name, but they tend to be more healthy type bacteria. And there's another big group called the bacteroidetes, which are kind of the bad in terms of health outcomes. And sometimes you can look at that ratio and find that if that ratio gets disturbed, because each one of those groups has thousands of species, but if that ratio gets messed up, that's when you can run into some problems. So there have been some studies in patients with underlying anxiety disorders that they may have less of that good group of bacteria. Those good bacteria make something called short chain fatty acids, which are very good about preventing toxins and bacteria to go from your from your intestine to your bloodstream. And so basically, when you have less of the good bacteria, you have an increase of things that can be harmful, that increase inflammation. And when you have increased inflammation, it can really decrease things like your serotonin levels. It can decrease your dopamine levels. So it decreases serotonin, dopamine, a lot of these things that you see with anxiety. So of course, the chicken and the egg, what came first, but there's a lot of evidence to think that potentially your microbiome may be affecting your brain. Now, from a philosophical perspective, I look at it all as a whole, there's probably several things going on at the same time interacting with each other, but I find that very interesting. Likewise, in patients with depression, that same issue is seen. There appears to be more toxin release in some of the microbiome, some of these patients in their stool, which affects inflammation and also affects serotonin levels. So the interesting thing about that is people said, well, what can you do in terms of, can you give some probiotics? These studies are so hard to do for three reasons. One, type of bacteria, type of strain. Two, how much you're giving. And then there's just so many variables sometimes, underlying family history of anxiety or depression, where you live, amount of pollution, things like that. But there may be some effect. And I was doing some looking, it's been a while since I kind of looked through all this stuff. And definitely for sure, there appears to be some studies that there's a relation with diet and mood disorders. So kind of the typical quote unquote Western diet where you eat hamburgers and French fries all day, you tend to have more mood disorders, and probably it's better to do a healthy diet. But honestly, that makes sense, right? We always talk about why a healthy diet and exercise is so important in so many aspects: cardiovascular health, prevention of osteoporosis in women. But there's probably a lot of evidence that's very helpful for brain health as well. And indeed, a healthy diet, not a Western type diet. One idea is that there's a lot more plasticity in your brain neurons by eating healthy. So if there is any type of damage, there's an ability to adapt centrally in your brain by eating healthy. And there's some very interesting aspects as well in terms of exercise. Exercise, we think, affects the microbiome for reasons that are not very clear. But people who are athletic tend to have a healthier microbiome than people who don't do anything. And there's some thought that that influences downstream. Cardiovascular health, perhaps decreased risk of cognitive disorders. So what does that mean to me? Well, simply put, that we all know, eating right and exercise is always the key, for sure. But there appears to be one of the aspects there is what happens with the microbiome. That having a healthy microbiome is preventative in many ways. Now, from a philosophical and theological perspective, what does that mean to be human? Does that mean being a human comprises our own eukaryotic cells and the billions and trillions of bacteria, not to mention the trillions of viruses as well that are in the gut and elsewhere? Does it encompass all that? And then more importantly, what does that mean in terms of what it means to be an organism and how we interact with the environment and with nature? And I would argue that the human microbiome is very helpful in understanding the importance of our communication in the setting of nature, and that we are natural, we are part of this universe. Going back to our discussion earlier about why it's so important to protect the planet, work against pandemics, because we are part of this universe. We're not separate from it. It's kind of a long answer. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Can I follow up and ask if the concept of the soul is of relevance to you and how you think about the human condition, or do you speak more in terms of consciousness? And either way, what type of relationship do you think? How would you describe the relationship between something like the soul or consciousness and this very complex physiological process that keeps us healthy?
I've kind of been all over the map with that through the years. I maybe it's the trend. I've really become more of a panpsychist as I've become older, and I think honestly the microbiome is one of the reasons for that, having done some writing about that. I would say that where is the cutoff between one's definition of soul and one's definition of consciousness? I think that, and you need to correct me because you'll probably know this better than me, but it turns out people define it. But would you say your soul and your consciousness are kind of the same things?
I would, I would say the soul or the psyche is a much larger idea that also includes, what a psychoanalyst would call the unconscious, which is not non-conscious. It's experiential still, but it's not available to our everyday rational waking ego, which would be consciousness, right? So the soul I would see as a bigger concept.
Okay. Yeah. So in terms of the soul, if I was to separate, say I don't know, I just have a huge issue with mind-body duality. I just have an issue with it, just for me personally, just because of, if someone gets sick, they feel terrible. Your soul is depressed, you feel down.
Yeah.
So I just have a problem separating that.
Me too.
Yeah. So I would say, so if the microbiome is so influential, potentially, not just for our overall health, but for our behavioral outcomes, what does that mean with the soul? Is it in communication with the environment? Is it part of nature itself? There was a time in my life I definitely was very much into just there being a mind and body, but in my religious faith, Christ resurrects the body and the soul, so they come together. So I would say really, I would look at more as more of a consciousness issue for me, in terms of how we interact with the environment. Isn't it interesting, by the way, that, and this is, I want people to realize, I'm just finding it ironic that Descartes talked about the pineal gland as the separation of the mind, or the connection point, I think, between the mind and the body. And here I was talking about the vagus nerve, which is one of the big communicators between the gut and the brain. And I'm not being a dualist, but it is interesting that he was thinking there must be some connection, but it may have been a little bit further down in the brain, which I think is really interesting, because so much is communication for reasons that are not entirely clear go through the vagus nerve.
Yeah. I mean, one of the more, I think, brilliant, but also often difficult to understand aspects of Alfred North Whitehead's thought, the process philosopher, is the way that he describes these sort of, the way that he understands soul or psyche as, fully like organic and physiologically distributed and realized, but that, he'll talk about the function of the nervous system and brain in a complex animal is to sort of amplify and channel these roots of transmission of feelings throughout the body, to pour all of this data into the interstices of the brain, he says, where the occasion of experience that we associate as with ourselves and say, this is me, I am this. It's a beautiful vision that's difficult to grasp, as I said, but it seems to suggest that the body and the physiological extended substance, as Descartes would call it, is itself in some way it's the outside of what intrinsically is composed of actual occasions of experience, right? So on the inside, it's experiential. On the outside, it appears to be just extended stuff. And the reason that dualism has been so convincing to people is that the point of contact between these two is so subtle, and so you can't visualize it, right? Because everything we visualize is extended in space, and somehow this is what's behind that, right? It's as if the body is an expression of this interior experiential process, but I think Whitehead shifts us into a view of the mind-body relationship that's not dualistic, but still kind of, it's a polarity, right? And so it's as though this externalized part of us that we can see and weigh, and you perform autopsies and there's no one home, but the body is still there, and maybe the micro processes have slowed down or stopped. There's no metabolism, but like that's the physical body. Something has left it, right? What has left? And for Whitehead, it's this like flowing process of inherited experience that's supported by the very delicate physiological activities of this body. But so it's like there is a distinction between consciousness and physiology, and yet you can never have one without the other. And that there's some kind of for a process thinker like Whitehead, there's a temporal relationship here between mind and body, where the body or the material aspect is sort of what's left in the wake of this continually creative mental process. And over the course of evolution, the form of our body has been shaped by this lure that's drawing the mental pole, right? But it allows us to both, I think, accept the temptation of dualism while also seeing why it's not two separate substances, and that the body is, and this is why Christianity is interesting to me, because of the place of the body and the question of like resurrection, what's going on there? Why is the body so important? And to me, it's a recognition of this profound relationality between mind and body, and that you can't really have one without the other. And so while there's a lot of talk of immortal souls too, it's never been entirely clear to me how this, I mean, on one hand, the doctrine of incarnation, but then also resurrection, it's not just the immortality of the soul, right? That is of import here. There's something about our bodily nature that is also of great value. Right? How do you see this when we to sort of shift over into a religious context? What sort of immortality,
Right.
if any, do you think may exist for the human being?
Well, I again, it's what I believe. I believe and I hope that there is some degree of immortality. As a father and a husband and as a child, I would like to, and a friend, I would like to have relationships longer than however long I'm on this earth, and that is my belief system. That's my faith, and we all come at it from our own metaphysics. But the way I would answer it would be to start looking at the body. And we have orifices. We have a mouth. We have a nose. So we're interacting. And that includes interacting with nature. And so let's take it to the microbiome. Not just the intestinal microbiome, but the microbiome in our lungs, the microbiome in our skin. So I'm a human, and I am objectively seeing the world, but I am subjectively, the classic, I'm seeing red. What does that mean if I am in contact with nature? And I know that the microbiome influences my brain in so many ways, influences my health outcomes in so many ways. Is there some reality that we don't understand in terms of subjectivity, in terms of how we interact with the microbiome and with nature itself? So when I say I see red, I'm actually exhibiting, I mean, it's a panpsychist answer, but am I exhibiting something more global going on, not just my brain doing that? And at the same time, you talked about, experiential. I wonder when you think about like a concrescence in a Whiteheadian sense, what is it about going from, from actuality to actuality over time, where you're experiencing through time, where your body is interacting and helping with those decisions? So what does it mean to be conscious? Do your bacteria in your body work together for these actualities? Does that make sense? Is there an actuality with the gut before the brain? So the first part I would say is, I think from a philosophical perspective, we need to think about, I think there's a lot of evidence that we know that the microbiome affects the human body physiologically, including the brain. A lot of evidence. So from a philosophical perspective, first, I would say, what does that mean with some of the great questions of philosophy? What does that mean? And what we talked about previously with free will. What does that mean about subjectivity in life? Now, from a theological perspective, and let me know if this is the direction you want me to go, because I don't want to just go off on tangents, but I have the microbiome in me. I am going to die someday and turn to dust. Bacteria will consume me. To me, I look at that as one of the great cycles of nature. And if I'm someone who believes that God is here, perhaps from a panentheist approach, I mean, I think it's part of God experiencing life with me. So I consume the food. And again, we're talking more in metaphysical terms. but I consume the food is digested, the bacteria come in, some stay, some leave, goes back into nature. There's this constant exposure of our bodies to the environment and to the universe, which you could say we are all part of nature. It really helps us understand we're not this separate thing looking at nature as these humans. Kind of Victorian idea. We are actually in nature itself. And I would argue that God is there. God experiences this. Now, from my religious strain as a Christian, but it'd be interesting to see how other religious strains look at it. I look at Jesus as being God and man, really experiencing this as well. Jesus ate, Jesus pooped, he talked about poop. So that for me as a Christian is very comforting that God experienced the same things that I go through. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think the image of God as Jesus was important for Whitehead too. His God, he describes as the fellow sufferer who understands. And so, there's nothing that we go through that the divine isn't experiencing with us. And I think I resonate with your sense of, having this hope that there might be a kind of personal immortality, but it's kind of hard to understand. And maybe we just can't understand how that might be possible. And we can't know for sure one way or the other, but there's another kind of immortality that you can grasp a little bit more easily when you consider, as you're describing, like we are these tubes ultimately. And there's something really important that happens while the energy, let's say, that flows through us is in our form. We're these cosmic conduits by which the universe and the divine can experience the human condition for a time. And I think what is experienced in and through each human being it adds to a growing, developing universe. Like each human life is a contribution not only to this universe, but to the divine nature as well. And so, what life after the death of this body might look like or be like, we can't know at this point. But it does seem reasonable to me to believe that the experiences that human beings have and the moral actions that human beings take leave a mark on the world that is enduring and ongoing and isn't lost, is remembered, right? Whether by other human beings or just by the fabric of nature more broadly. And so I think that there are these two different ways to kind of relate to this question. You don't have to believe in a personal afterlife and a sort of literal scheme of immortality like that to still be able to acknowledge, the contributions that human beings make, to the ongoing human project and cosmic evolutionary project.
I agree. Yeah, and I think that, that comes down to the question. I was listening to an interview with Lee Smolin just yesterday, actually, where, he actually quoted Whitehead. He was being interviewed by a gentleman named Robert Wright. I've heard another interview with Lee Smolin where he's made some process type metaphors. So I think is actively reading or just finished reading Whitehead, which I thought was really interesting. But in this process of creation, it's just like you said, it's our moment, as we pass through time, and I think that a process person, I would think that time is very fundamental it's not an emergent phenomenon. It's one of the most fundamental aspects of what we deal with. So being a memory of God eternally, and if that memory goes on after we die as an afterlife, to me, that I find that very comforting. The other thing I was just thinking, I love that idea. I mean, I'm going to steal that from you, the whole idea of us just basically being a tube. I mean, you think about, the earliest animals that we know of in evolutionary history are tubes, right? So they are in contact with nature, bringing things in, bringing things out. And you can go to simple single cell life where there's through receptors bringing things in. And what are they bringing in? They're bringing in things they're interacting with the environment. So once again, exhibiting, experiencing nature, but they're bringing things in simply for energy. In many ways, I look at process as change, as energy over time. So I think that's a really good point you brought up.
Yeah. I think I would have to credit Alan Watts, the sort of Buddhist philosopher. He was an Anglican priest and then became a Buddhist philosopher and moved out to California. He, in his book, The Taboo Against Knowing Who You Are, I think is where I first read this account of human beings as souped up tubes, basically. I think I'm going to need to wrap up here because got some other meetings this afternoon, but we should definitely do this again.
Absolutely.
Continue the conversation. I've really enjoyed it. Is there anything else that was on your mind that you wanted to share before we wrap up here? Or?
No. First of all, thanks for meeting with me and taking time out of your day. I think that this has been a very constructive conversation for me, and I'm trying to think what, if people are listening, what they can get out of this. I think there's a lot of things. The things I got out of it were that we need to look at these touch points between religion and science, between science and philosophy, between science and philosophy and theology, to make progress. And we need to do this through communication, collaboration, not through debate. I think that was a really important point that you brought up. I think that I think we've talked about is there are some really interesting science aspects about the microbiome. And I think there's some really fascinating philosophy and theological aspects. And I think that having these conversations and moving these questions forward to cut around the edges is extremely helpful. And again, dialogue, not debate, I think should be where we need to go in these situations. Yeah. And then I appreciated our conversation we had about the scientific method and the advance of science as a type of religion in certain ways. I've been reading, I don't know, I found her the other day, Dorothy Emmett. Do you know Dorothy Emmett? You probably do. I don't know if you know who Dorothy Emmett is. She's she actually trained. She trained under Whitehead. Yeah, and you just don't ever. And I've been reading The Nature of Metaphysical Thinking, 1949. And she talks about analog being basically the backbone of metaphysics. So I really like that. So in other words, if you take what you've learned in science advancement, for example, what can you do that to apply that to your metaphysics? What can you do that to understand as a believer in God of what this God is? I really found that helpful. It was actually fun. This book is out of publication, so I got it used. And some gentleman in 1950 wrote all these notes.
Wow, that's cool.
And so now I'm reading it. So talk about the passage of time and how it made me feel. I thought it was really interesting. So anyway, those are the things, and I really appreciate that. And again, I've been watching your YouTube channel for a while, and you and I think, sat in some similar Zoom meetings in the past, and I've heard you speak. But I appreciate everything that you're doing to advance this conversation. It's much appreciated.
Oh, thanks. Thanks, John. It's very kind of you to say. And yeah, really appreciate the conversation and that summary at the end. Yeah, let's do this again. But for now, we'll leave it there. And yeah, keep up the good work. I know,
You too. You too.
You're helping people and you're trying to advance knowledge in this particular area. And it's really exciting because I see that there's some major breakthroughs on the horizon. So
All right. Thank you. Take care, my friend.
take care.
Bye.